Okay, so today we're talking about virtues and vices, and there's a lot to cover with this, but we're going to hopefully hit a lot of the umbrellas of it. The virtues, both the cardinal or moral virtues of prudence, temperance, justice, and fortitude that we read about, and the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. And then we'll talk a bunch about that, and also relying on virtue, the fall of virtue, and also vice. And one thing that Father had already mentioned last week is that virtue is a habit. And so that's something that I just want to go over in the beginning, that virtue does not exist in individual acts, but it always exists within the person. Virtue can never be abstracted from the human person. Even the word virtue comes from the Latin word virtus, which has the root word vir, of man, and it means, or like translates almost to like manliness or the fullness of man and strength. And it always lives within the soul of a person or within a person. So it's not just isolated acts, it's this habitual and deliberate, repeated action that builds in a person and repeats over and over again. So you wouldn't say that someone who does one good act or a few good acts here and there would constitute as a virtuous person. And it was funny, I was driving into work today and thinking about virtues, and I was thinking, if I drove in to work each day, and, most of the times I didn't hit people or didn't, rear end people or sideswipe a parked car, I wouldn't be considered a good driver still. It would need to be repeated and repeated that I didn't get into accidents or that I did something good while driving, avoided some hazard, but not just a few isolated times. And my insurance company sure want to think of that. I was also thinking we started, because a lot of when we think of virtue and human excellence and building it over time, you might think of someone who really is good at a craft or some practice, a musician or an athlete. So we started playing young adult basketball downstairs and in the gym recently. And every once in a while, people will make a hoop, get a hoop, whatever the terminology is. If you're at the right angle, for me, I always need to be on the right side of the hoop. I can't have anyone around me. But that doesn't make a good player, a good basketball player. So in order to be good, to be excellent at something, it's a repeated thing over and over again. There's a consistency to virtue, which is really in the essence of what it is. And we read a little bit about this and talked about it last week when Father Seamus was mentioning the kind of the classics, the philosophers, and this attainment of happiness and excellence. And we believe that virtues are really what leads the person to attain the fullest excellence and be fully who God made them to be. And now there's virtues that we're going to talk about, the cardinal virtues first, which are also called natural. And they are understood more on a human level of perfecting them. And all the virtues, which I probably will repeat over and over again, they're still all rooted in God, even though there's the three theological virtues. All of these virtues, of course, because we're in our humanity, we are made by God, all are still rooted in God. But these virtues on a natural level, we see as us having an interplay in them. And Father mentioned this last week, that you might know someone who you can say is very virtuous in many ways, or has a lot of qualities of prudence or justice, and they might not have faith. They might not be receiving the sacraments. They might not be getting those kind of specific graces from God. So it goes. There's a limit to that, of course, but there's certain virtues of this human quality and natural quality that we're going to talk about. And last week we talked about the intellect and the will and that interplay in moral responsibility. And all of these virtues are about perfecting the intellect and the will, the ability to know, to love, and also like to think, to reason. An interesting thing is early Christians, and we read a little bit about this in the Piper reading, that some of the Christians were skeptical in using the same virtues that, Aristotle and Cicero wrote about, because they thought it wasn't scriptural enough, that maybe this was like too outside of the realm of Christianity. So they were a little bit skeptical about that, and they were worried that the virtues were something that were too philosophical, and that's what Piper talks about. And it's interesting to think of that just in the outset, even as I was kind of thinking about this topic, to really have us grounded in our faith, because some of this we can talk about from a purely philosophical maybe realm, or even a psychological. You might have found that when we had our readings on prudence. But to know that these are still all rooted in our faith. But just to go back a little to Aristotle, we didn't have more reading from him this week, but he says, you should find a virtuous man and imitate him. That was one of the kind of suggestions that Aristotle gives in growing in virtue. And that is very much applicable to our faith. We know that there's one man in particular who came that we are to model and to imitate. And Aristotle, in his writing, he describes it almost as an apprenticeship, that you're watching the actions of someone. Okay, how do they do it there? And then you're getting feedback on your actions, just how Jesus taught the apostles. So going back to that, this suspicion, or kind of this wrestling with, okay, we have these virtues that the philosophers had mentioned, and now in our moral teaching as Christians, we're incorporating them into this. And Piper writes about how some people were more comfortable with just talking about Christian morality in the sense of only the commandments, the list of rules, and not in the sense of virtue as it was described similar to Aristotle and the philosophers. And this is an important point, because of course those are important, the commandments. Even if you kind of see how our class has been structured up until this point, we know we're learning morality, all of this at this point, after we've had the foundation of the commandments, scripture, a lot of different areas that have informed our faith and our knowledge of Christianity. But that's not where it ends. The Ten Commandments is not where it ends. And it's not the full picture, it's a piece of it. But in the development of the moral person, the virtuous person, it goes beyond just that, not just a checklist. And this goes right into the definition of virtuous or virtues in general, that it can't just be about the isolated actions, it's about the whole person and the whole person of faith that is going to, of course it's important to follow those commandments, have an informed conscience, but they're a part of a much bigger picture of the whole person with a goal of union with God and a foundation of love of God for the reason for all of these commands. So morality at the base, and this is a review of what Father Seamus said in a way, morality is about attaining the good, not finishing a checklist or avoiding a checklist. It's about attaining the good and rearranging our lives to move towards that goal. And I know Father Seamus had the picture last week of the horse and the intellect and the will, and we'll bring a little bit of that back. So it's about the flourishing of the person in the sense of not just like a self-help book, become the best you, but an orientation of someone's life and ordering to an ultimate goal. So St. Ambrose, he was the first to call prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance the cardinal virtues. And he described them as being the central to good living. And in our reading from Augustine, I enjoy the way he frames each of these virtues in love. So he gives a very short definition, which I'm just going to review now a little bit, on each of them and what they mean for love. So for temperance, he says, temperance is love giving itself entirely to what is loved, or that which is love. Love. So I'm going to shorten that to love giving itself entirely. And then he says fortitude, and I don't need to number these. I'm not numbering them in any particular order. Fortitude is love readily bearing all things for the sake of the loved. And I'm going to shorten that to love readily bearing all things. Justice is love serving the object loved. And prudence is love distinguishing with understanding what hinders it and what helps it. So I'm going to shorten that. Love distinguishing what hinders and what helps. That was a little messy. Hopefully you can read that. And he goes on to describe that it's not just anything that's the object of love. It's God that he means ultimately in all of these objects of love. And he goes on to explain each one a little bit more in depth. But I really like those simple definitions. And we're going to take some time and go through each one of these cardinal virtues. And we'll go, this isn't necessarily like in a particular order, but I want to end with prudence because we had a lot of reading on prudence. So I thought we would spend a little bit more time on that. So temperance, he says, is keeping itself entire and incorrupt for God. Temperance, and I'm going to incorporate a little bit of the catechism too, it moderates the attraction towards good things or towards pleasures, and it provides a balance in them. So it's about mastering the will over instincts, and keeping desires within a limit of what is honorable and what is good. It's a promotion of a balance in goods. I was talking to someone recently who was talking about tempering chocolate. I don't know if any of you have ever done that, but it's this process where the makeup of chocolate is such that like the molecules or crystals within it are stacked in different patterns. And for a chocolate to be stable and not to melt or be unstable, it has to be in a certain crystal pattern. So they do this thing where they try to balance the crystal patterns in there and have the ideal one promoted. So there's an ideal structure to each of these chocolate or cocoa butter molecules that they try to attain. And it's this interesting process of like raising it up, melting. But I was thinking of that like process of balancing the good of it to make a stability, a stable chocolate, and in our lives, trying to strike balance of pleasures or goods in our life that will bring us to the fullness of flourishing. Temperance, it comes from the Latin word temperantia. It means moderation or self-control. And control is a big part of what you might have noticed in the catechism as well, having some sort of control over your passions. And we'll talk a little bit more about passions later. And with temperance, I was thinking about it, and I was thinking there was a whole, many of us probably are familiar about this, with this during Prohibition. There was a whole temperance coalition of people when this collective kind of vice of alcohol abuse was a problem in the 1920s in the United States, where many people were lobbying or trying to push, and they did, to prohibit the sale and transportation of alcohol. So this was trying to promote a temperance, and they had the women's Christian temperance movement. So I was thinking about that because I remembered learning about that. Interestingly, there was many Catholics who were against that, and you can kind of see why, that this kind of collective, they were kind of saying, we don't have the ability to temper this, so we're just going to forbid it. And that's usually not the route of our faith. The goal is that there's usually a way to temper, or not usually, there is. That's our belief, that there are goods, that is very scriptural, that to have goods, but in an order and in a balance, that we're able to enjoy them without it becoming a hindrance to our flourishing. We might go a little bit more to temperance later, but I want to move on to fortitude. He says it as love readily bearing all things. And I love what he writes later on, because he kind of relates it to temperance, because he says if temperance is kind of keeping a focused love on God, fortitude means that, as we step back from earthly things or order the earthly things, fortitude is bearing the loss of earthly things. And I think this is an interesting way to put it, bearing the loss of earthly things. Fortitude is a really interesting virtue. And it relates, as Augustine explains, that it relates to our resoluteness in practicing any other virtue. With fortitude, we can be faced with extreme loss of earthly things that can go as extreme to loss of life, when we think of the Christian martyrs who practiced fortitude through their perseverance through the end and not denying faith. And as I was reading his explanation of fortitude, I don't know if as he kind of vaguely talks about this loss of earthly things. A story, this isn't from our reading. I know we read from Saint Therese, the story of a soul, and Saint Teresa of Avila. But in another section of the story of a soul, there was a scene that I always remembered of Saint Therese, and it reminded me of a smaller loss of earthly things. God bless you. So she was taking care of another nun in her convent, and she has this vision of a ballroom with young women her age. You remember? The image of it stuck with me too. But she's like wheeling her down the corridor, and she has this vision of other young women her age. She was probably 19 at the time. And she sees like a vision of them dancing and dressed nicely, and like thinking about what many other 19-year-olds are doing. And here she is in this cold convent taking care of this nun who is really grouchy towards her. And she finds like this delight. She's kind of delighted by it because she's like, I have the better one. But I wanted to share a little bit about it because I think it's a good example of a small way that we can have fortitude, not only in larger ways. And it also touches on, we talked about this a little bit last week, there's a goal to practice virtue in a way that has an ease and a joy to it. And we mentioned that a little bit last week. But so she said, I was carrying out my usual task one winter evening. It was cold and dark. Suddenly, far away from some distant orchestra, there came the sound of music. I seemed to see a richly furnished room, all bright with lights and resplendent, where young ladies, beautifully dressed, exchanged the countless courtesies of social life. My eyes turned back to the poor invalid I was helping. In place of the music, plaintive groans from time to time. In place of the resplendent room, nothing but the cloister walls, austere, scarcely visible in the flickering light. The contrast softly touched my soul. Our Lord poured in the light of truth, which shines brighter than the shadowy light of earthly pleasures. I would not exchange 10 minutes spent on my act of charity for 1,000 years of such worldly delights. I thought that was a beautiful thing. She would not exchange 10 minutes of taking care of this nun from thousands of years of being at that party. So there's a different degree, and Augustine writes a little bit about this. There's a different degree of fortitude demanded of various people. We're not all going to be martyrs or all going to be tested to an extreme way. He mentions St. Paul and his fortitude in enduring a lot during his ministry. But there's, other, smaller ways to practice fortitude. I don't know if any of you, this came to mind when I was thinking of fortitude. There's a book that was a New York Times bestseller, I think for years and years. It was one of the top self-help books, Atomic Habits. I don't know if anyone has ever read it. You just read it? Oh yeah. So there's this, I haven't read the entire thing, but there's this, it's about how to form habits. So kind of related to virtue. But the interesting thing, and not all, a lot of it is practical, of how to form the habits. But one thing that I thought in it was kind of, it is challenged a little bit by fortitude, is that they say you need to make a habit easy. And I was thinking, a lot of times people interpret this, they're like, leave the lettuce at the front of the fridge, or leave your gym clothes by your bed and you'll go to the gym, or something, making a task easy. But the virtue of fortitude, it really informs that a lot of the habits or practice that we'll have to do again and again is not necessarily going to be easy, but that hopefully it can be made that way. There was a question, I think Brandon, it was you last week, that was there's some credit for something being a little bit hard at first. So there's this interesting interplay of okay, we know that the habits, the virtue that we have to develop as Christians, as Catholics, is not easy, and we don't have a lot of control over the situations that we're going to encounter when we need to practice virtue. So there's a lot that's going to be unexpected, but there's certain ways that we believe that go beyond kind of our own abilities that can get us to a point where we're like Saint Therese or one of the other saints, that we find joy in difficulty or find an ease even in doing it. I think of our Lord's words in Matthew. He says, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. Take my yoke upon you. So there's this kind of mixture of it. Of course, all of us know from experience, a lot of these things are not easy to be virtuous and to continue to practice that. Saint Therese talks about another time in her book about how she was doing laundry with another nun, and the nun kept splashing her with dirty water. And she was getting so annoyed. She wanted to stop. And then she was like, weeks later, I came to a place and I was like, you know what? This is a good practice for humility. I better come to do laundry more often. So there's these little practices that can help us try to have that ease and just that regularity of it. C.S. Lewis, he says, fortitude is every other virtue at its sticking point, or at its point of testing. So he explains that if you don't have fortitude, you really can't have any other virtue, because you won't have it when you need it the most, because you'll be overcome by fear. Fortitude tempers our fear. I'll move on to justice, but I thought it was interesting, and the Lorda reading, the one who wrote about Opus Dei, and a little bit later in our readings, he's called fortitude the most attractive attribute in the human personality. And he notes that it's important, though, that this strength comes from love of God, that it's not rooted in just general human strength, because there is the possibility to be strong about things that aren't rooted in the love of God. So he reminds us of St. Paul's quote about, "I can do all things in him who strengthens me." That's really key, because we know that to have fortitude is to do, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, it has to play into prudence of doing the right thing that's directed. Justice, the lover serving the object of love. So justice is about love of God and love of neighbor. And it's about serving God, and he describes it as ruling well over all else. And this reminded me of our baptismal call, that we're called to be priest, prophet, and king. And the king one is always interesting to me. And I think of that in relation to justice a lot, of ruling well, serving others well, and giving people what is due, or what is due from them. For justice, Augustine reminds that someone can only serve two masters. So the lover of justice must serve God, and through that serve everyone else, all of God's people. And the Catechism kind of divides. It says the justice of God, or justice for God, is called the virtue of religion. And then there's justice towards all men, which is supposed to dispose people to respect the rights of one another. And, I think Aquinas writes about this too, because he asked the question, interestingly, in the Summa, justice is the section that is the largest section. Well, that might not be as surprising. It has a lot on law, on judgment, on that. But over all the other sections, this is the one that St. Thomas Aquinas wrote the most questions about. I forget how many, I don't think I wrote it down, but there's a ton of questions on justice. And he asked the question, or leads to the question of, well, what is due to someone? If justice is giving someone his due, how do we know what is due? What is the object of that? And so we know that it has to be a legitimate right. So a legitimate right, and he describes them in categories. So there could be natural legitimate rights, which would be like the right to your life, the right to life. Or even, he explains, marriage is another natural right. He also explains laws. So, our right to vote, or our, any other legal right that we might have. So this is, and of course there's varying degrees, because we know not the legal and the political. He basically describes in the Summa how, because we're humans, we live in a society, and everything we do is never as an isolated person. We're always impacting someone else by any decision we make, whether that's directly or indirectly, that we're people who are impacting society by our actions. So that's part of what justice lends itself to, is how to give another his due and act rightly towards others in society. he explains that there could be many types, and I'm not going to necessarily put this in virtue or in vice when we talk about it later, but he describes some injustice. There is injustice in deed, which might be like the taking of another person's life, killing, theft, but there also is injustice in speech. And this is an interesting one too, that he explains. The injustice in speech could, there's a whole, there's many parts of it, but it's trying to, like, if you're trying to malign someone or hurt or unjustly, he would say unjustly hurt another's friendship, unjustly hurt another's reputation. That's an act of injustice too. I think we'll move on to prudence. Prudence in many ways is what informs every other virtue. And we learn that in the Catechism and in Augustine's writing. There is this image, and it might have been from Aquinas, I'm forgetting who said this, but it's like if all the virtues are like horses in a chariot. It's a little different from Father Seamus's example. This isn't about the intellect and will. This is about all the virtues. Prudence would be the head, the charioteer, guiding all of the other virtues. And in our Piper reading, we read a lot about prudence. So prudence, love distinguishing what hinders and what helps. I remember, and you probably over the course of Sequitur, Father Seamus has mentioned, prudence is about doing the right thing at the right time in the right way. And so that's an important part of prudence. It helps us carry out any other virtue by looking at the reality of the situation. It is about like a discernment and a watchfulness. Piper talks about the misconception of the word prudence, of how it's used in a colloquial way of, it often for people might mean like a small-minded or someone who has like a concern for self-preservation or is just selfish, kind of like closed in. And he says, that's not at all what prudence means in our faith. Prudence, and he ties it to fortitude a lot. He says, some people might think that the prudent person is the person who doesn't act, who doesn't have fortitude, or who just says no to everything. But it's actually the opposite, because you can't have fortitude or justice without being prudent, without judging rightly what that actually is. This reminded me of Joseph from the Old Testament. We look at Joseph, he was put in charge, right, of all of the storehouses of storing grain. So he's this really good example of someone who was able to judge rightly. He knew that there was going to be 7 years of abundance, and in that time, he started to store these grains in Egypt. Again, even St. Joseph's Day was feast day, of the Holy Family was yesterday. Another example of someone we look to as an example of prudent, that we know he didn't say anything in Scripture and wasn't, we don't know a ton about him from that, but we know that he was righteous, and he was given the great responsibility to judge a lot of situations that were important in the life of the Holy Family. He had to judge timing, the right way to do something, and what the right thing was. So he had a lot of judgments and a lot of responsibility to make in his life. Lastly, just to mention another scriptural part, the prudent steward is a parable that Jesus tells us about. And he says, I don't know if I want to read this whole thing, but he talks about, I'll skip to the end a little bit. He says, "Be sure of this, if the master of the house had known the hour when the thief was coming, he would not have let his house be broken into. You also must be prepared, for at an hour you do not expect the Son of Man will come." Then Peter said, "Lord, is this parable meant for us or for everyone?" And the Lord replied, "Who then is the faithful and prudent steward whom the master will put in charge of his servants to distribute the food allowance at the proper time? Blessed is the servant whom his master on arrival finds doing so. Truly I say to you, he will put him in charge of all of his property." So he speaks of this prudent steward, that even when he knows that it's not just because someone's looking over his shoulder that he's doing what was asked of him, but because it was what was asked of him by his master, he was doing the right thing, when he doesn't know exactly when he will arrive. So prudence informs our whole practice of the other virtues, as I mentioned. So many of those who wrote about virtue put prudence at the top. A part of this that I'm going to touch on from the Piper reading, he mentions the cognition and memory aspects of prudence. And he says, prudence presupposes a knowledge of reality in a way. And so, someone could have a good intention to do something, but that wouldn't mean that it was a prudent decision of how they went about it, even with their intention. Because what they would lack in that case is, if they didn't act prudently, they might have a good intention, but they may have misread a lot of things and had a lack of understanding of the reality of the situation. So this element of cognition, it enables us to attain perception. It enables us to perceive objective reality of what we know is concretely real. And he says this is something that can't be short-circuited. And that doesn't mean that in order to act virtuously, we need to deliberate for 1,000,000 years on how to act. But it means that you need to have an honest evaluation, an honest thoughtfulness about the reality of a situation in order to judge how to act. We learn later in our readings too, I forget who it was, that indecisiveness is not part of the virtues, but that you need to have an honest, thoughtful evaluation. And so it was kind of interesting. I don't know for you when you were reading that about that cognition part too, if it was kind of raising questions for you. You're like, well, what if you don't know the situation, the reality, or what if it's really hard? And he explains, he says, through baptism, we know that God gives us what is necessary for salvation. And he says there can be a more full practice of prudence by the habitual, the growing in virtue of it. And that there's a grace involved with it, that, some people might have a more, like a natural ability to understand situations more. They might be more able to cognitively understand more. But he says this, and he notes it too, that it's pretty comforting that Aquinas says it, is that a person can be guided by the counsel of others and informed by other sources outside of themselves. And that we believe that God gives grace to people when asked, gives grace to help people receive counsel in a way that they can be discerning of it, and distinguish good from evil counsel. So it's an interesting point. Like, okay, we all might not have the same capability of understanding a situation. Certainly, there's other factors. There's age. A 4-year-old, you wouldn't really say a 4-year-old is prudent. We don't believe that they have that reasoning until after the age of reason. Then they start to grow in that. And he also mentions memory. And memory he ties, directly into this evaluation of what is true and a reasoning of what happened, but this time in the past. And he said, when you think of the objective reality, it shapes action. And you want in memory, it's remember things as they actually were. So he said the falsification of recollection, and in this case, this is important, by the assent or negation of the will. So if you falsely remember something by accident, it's different than if you're like carelessly, just leaving out parts here and there, or if you're portraying something that as, oh, I remember this for a fact, and the truth is you really don't remember that fully, or you're tweaking things or leaving things out here and there. And that's not just it of when you're explaining something that has happened in the past, but when that's informing, to yourself, you're like, oh, well, this person did that, and you're ignoring a completely other part of the situation. But in your mind, it's leading you to a decision about how to act that is not prudent because you're leaving a part of it out. He said, it is a danger to truth of real things to have false memory, slight retouches, displacements, discolorations, omissions, or shifts of accent. So even if you are, you're shifting, it's like, okay, you're remembering something, but it's not in proportion to how it actually went. And I'm sure many of us know this from things we've thought of this way before, or had someone else close to us that you're like, no, that was not how it happened. So you see in this that there's this natural level of ability that we really need to work on in order to, if you were going to be the perfectly prudent person, if you were going to really, really seek to be prudent, that there would be some factors to really look at in how we are understanding reality. And we know that it's not easy. I was thinking of even our memories fail us all the time of how we remember things. I remember learning about this, like even in a police lineup when they have the criminals, and it's like, I forget the percentage, but it's wrong a ton of time. And people will be like, I swear to God, that is the person that, committed that crime. And they'll be completely off, So our memory can deceive us sometimes. So he notes, after he talks about the cognition and the memory a lot, he says, this isn't just psychology. It sounds, we're getting into the realm of psychology a bit. And he says, he calls it the metaphysics of the ethical person. It's about how people can become more ethical. And this is, I think, one of the biggest parts, or one big takeaway that I had from it is, he says, no man is self-sufficient in matters of prudence. No man is self-sufficient. So if you think that you're a very prudent person and you're really good at evaluating reality on your own with no help from anyone else, you're probably not very good at it. With all of these virtues, there has to be a lot of humility with it. But this is really important because if you know a kid, let's say they're over the age of reason, over the age of 7, they are not alone forming what it means to be prudent in a certain situation. And none of us here have been or are to this day, and only by ourselves knowing what is the reality and what is prudent. So there's a docility to it too, of like, okay, this is how I perceiving it, and that might not be correct. I need to help inform how I am evaluating the reality of this situation. And if you're reading this, you might have been thinking, I was thinking, like, what about people who are completely out of touch with reality? And he mentions it later on. He says, neurosis or different, mental health things are a barrier to this. And he emphasizes again, that's another reason why people are not on their own in judging things that are prudent. And it's an important thing to think about, even in how we know, we see others acting in certain ways, and we know that it's maybe not informed by the same reality that we are experiencing. We'll finish up a little bit on prudence and then go to the theological verses. Sure, yeah.
What's up, like St. John Paul II, love and responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
He says that the ability to have responsibility is, for a person, is the more that we have a responsibility for a person in a situation, the more we have the ability to love that, that we have that real love for that person. So I just think that when you were saying about ability, it seems good.
Thank you. That gives me a drink break too.
So just, we'll close up a little bit on reality, but it's important to know also, in any prudent act, there's always a degree of uncertainty, because we might, in the act itself, we don't know what the reality after our action will be. So I might have something that I need to, there can be so many situations, but I might have something that I'm like, okay, I think this is the prudent way to approach this, to say this to this person. I have no idea how they'll actually respond to it, or if my attempt to be prudent will go well. So with this degree of uncertainty, there still is that obligation to do something, to not let that hinder you from acting, actually. Aquinas says that the certitude of prudence cannot be so great as completely to remove all anxiety. So there's still going to be a sense of, okay, I don't know what's going to happen. And I think, some of these things, you'll see how they directly tie into these theological virtues, that, we believe that a lot of this, it's not just our natural human ability or our virtues. There's a reality that's supernatural, that we have some ability to judge and to evaluate, but there's a whole supernatural reality that we might not be aware of or we are not aware of. So in some of these situations, there is going to be that degree of uncertainty. Prudence, just as another note, and I think this just is to reiterate it, it's not just about the final goal, but it's about how you get there. What is the means to the end? So someone could have the same goal or want the same end, but go about it in a very imprudent way, and really undermine it in some way. Prudence, is, as I mentioned, is connected to the other virtues. A lack of prudence would include thoughtlessness, indecisiveness, or negligence. And this is jumping a little bit ahead, but the question of okay, what if you don't have prudence, or you don't think you're necessarily a prudent person, can you still be practicing the other virtues to some extent? And Piper writes, I think it was him in that reading, that most of us, we experience our practice of the virtues, we experience in an uneven way. So although all virtues are connected, and in many ways they kind of rise and fall together, like if you don't have one, it kind of hurts the others, and they're connected. But many of us experience particular, and this will get into vices a little bit, particular ones that are challenging for us. And we have this kind of uneven ebb and flow as we practice the virtues. just to kind of wrap up prudence, actually all of these virtues, these are all umbrellas. So there's many other virtues that would fall within these categories. But these are the four that really would encompass any of the virtues we would practice. So just as an example, temperance, the virtues of abstinence or sobriety, chastity, continence, meekness, a bunch of them would fall under temperance. The same with fortitude, patience, perseverance, magnanimity, all fall within that too. And those are all really interesting ones, because you can kind of look into them and be like, oh yeah, like I don't know, know too much about how that is even defined. There's one I don't know if you've ever heard of, but munificence. Munificence is similar to generosity in a way. It falls under the category of fortitude, and Aquinas talked about it. But it's a habit to do great works for the benefit of others, either in generosity, like, monetarily, or just in your giving of yourself. So it's like generosity, even like elevated more of just like this true disposition and willingness to give a lot to people. I think we'll take a short break, and then we'll go to theological virtues and vice. We'll take like 5 minutes. So the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. These are the God virtues. But like I said, all other virtues, of course, depend on God. But these are the virtues that are particularly beyond the human's natural ability. And we know last time we talked about this finding of the search for happiness and the finding of happiness in doing the good. And we know the happiness of heaven is vastly higher than earthly happiness. So all of this virtue, like we said before, is oriented towards a goal, and it's to sharing in the life of God, it's rooted in love of Him, and to being with Him forever in that love. And we need the help of God's grace for each of those that we learned about before. And then we believe that the theological virtues are completely given to us by God, not on our own accord or our own practice. So, one thing about this is that no repeated action without the theological virtues, for example, faith, no repeated action of doing something without God giving us the virtue of faith will lead us to faith. Nothing we repeatedly do without Him will lead us to that. So it can, a repeated action of, maybe exercising the intellect, using reason, can help prime people. That's why they say, like, I might be wrong. Is it the philosopher is the handmaid of theology? Is that what they say? Okay. So that it's like a priming. It's like, okay, the ability to reason well, to understand these concepts that can lead us closer to understanding God. But faith, we believe, is given to us by God. First imparts it to our soul, and by this we are able to act through faith and to have faith in Him. So these theological virtues, all three of them, are this supernatural goodness. And in brief, I think I would say it's participation in the life of the Trinity. In brief, those are the theological virtues. They are stable powers that are supernatural, infused into us by God. that raise us up to something higher, to Him. So faith perfects the intellect. You can't have a perfected intellect without having faith. It bestows a higher light to the mind and allows us to attain this truth of God. Faith, there's so many misconceptions about faith, but I think our understanding of the virtues really reiterate over and over again how they're supported by reason. And so we know that faith is it's not contrary to reason, which sometimes it can be described as. I think even some Catholics sometimes describe it to other people, and they don't even mean to do this, but they describe it in a way where it seems like a superstition, or it seems like, well, you can't know anything at all, but you just got to believe it. So they take reason completely out of it, and they don't realize that it just does it in injustice. We know that, of course, faith is the gift, and it cooperates with reason. It is not against reason. But it's not a superstition or a naivete or just a blanket of acceptance of something that can't be reasoned as well. Faith in many ways is a surrender also to that truth that you learn from your faith in God, in Christ. And this virtue, all of the theological virtues as well, help us and try to guide us to avoid error in our life as Catholics. One of them is thinking that we can practice our faith, have faith alone without help from God, and that we can attain heaven or attain wonderful understanding by our own power and our own, cunning, or, if we're exceptionally intelligent or something like that, we think that somehow we maybe can attain the greatest good just on our own. And the theological virtues, we know, they dispel that false belief. They also would go against the belief that because the prize of eternal life, of heaven, is a gift to us, that it doesn't matter as much what we do in this life. Or there's only a certain limit of what we must do in this life to gain that prize. That's also another incorrect assumption. So faith is not just a belief in God or a part of it, but it also is a belief in what has been revealed to us by God. So faith goes then beyond just like, okay, I have faith in a vague idea of God or believe God, but it's, like I said before, this submission in a way, a giving of self to also have faith in what was revealed by Him. With that faith, and the Catechism explains it, is it comes with a duty to profess the faith and to not walk away from the faith. Especially in times where it might be challenging to identify as someone of faith. Hope is the next one. Hope elevates our will, so it's an elevation of our will to be able to trust in God. And it causes us to desire the kingdom of heaven and have eternal hope. It was interesting in the Pope Francis put out, I think it was an encyclical about love in the family, and he wrote that hope is a virtue that our society is suffering from in many ways because of things being so instant. And he says that hope of things being awaited for that are longer in the distance is something that just because of how we live each day with technology and things being so instant, that it's a little bit harder for people to grasp such a long-term thing as eternity. So he says that's one of the virtues that we really need to pray for and really cooperate with when we receive. The Beatitudes are central to our understanding of what hope is. Because what do the Beatitudes list out? They list out what a blessed or a happy person is, and that's our hope of what to achieve. Another misconception, just like the misconception of faith maybe being subrational or naive, hope could be mistook for optimism. And they're different, hope and optimism, because some people might think, okay, well, if you follow the commandments, you live a virtuous life, you're devout, then you'll have a good life a good life, not in the sense of, in a worldly sense. You might be successful, make a lot of money, not have the burden of illness or other heavy burdens. And it sounds kind of even ridiculous just saying it, but there's many people who believe that. Some people may have heard it as the prosperity gospel, which some of these televangelists preach, that it's like, okay, well, if you have faith and do this, you can hope for a great life here and a lot of blessings. And that's not our faith. It's like, have you read the Bible? You're in store for a little bit of a surprise. You look at someone like St. Paul and what he would write then. And so it's like, our hope is not, okay, it will all be well and it's all going to get better from here on this earth in that worldly sense. The sickness will go away or you won't suffer. It's the opposite of that. And in a way, our faith would even just like take for granted, or when we read scripture, it takes for granted all of that in some way. It's like, no, there is going to be suffering. And the hope is that Christ is with you through all of that and you'll meet him at the end. And so that's this sense of hope. That's not optimism. Not to say optimism is bad. I mean that in the sense of like, it's not a hope as in like, okay, all will be great by the end. We know even Mother Teresa wrote towards the end of her life just about great suffering, even spiritually, that she went through. But she still held this hope, and there was this kind of darkness that she had to endure.
Yeah.
Can you jump back to faith for a second? Where one of the readings said, faith does not reunite the believer with Christ and does not make him a living member of his body when it is deprived of hope and love. Can you talk about that? That was 1815.
Read the part. I think same with the natural virtues. They're all linked together. So you can't have faith without having hope and love. And certainly we know when we get to love is going to be the greatest of all of them, right? Love is going to be the biggest. So it would be a false faith if you had, if you said you had faith, but what you have faith in is something different than the hope of the resurrection and life with Christ and the love of God, then it would be not be a true faith, what we believe in as faith. It's interesting. We just had our sacrament prep retreat for the younger kids, and we were talking about prayer, and it's interesting because like we were talking about kind of spirituality, like all these different things, and this one girl was like, well, yeah, I believe like there's like some cool things, and she talked about, I think I mentioned this to you, Father, I don't know, but she mentioned, she was like, oh, I read something or I watched something. This is like a little second grader or third grader, where like someone spread the ashes of a loved one and it said, I love you. So then you knew the hope that someone loved them. And I was like, it was this interesting thing of like, okay, there can be this there's she's looking for like, okay, yes, we are those who pass away. That love is still there, that still is real. But faith, and this is what he means, it needs to be oriented to, we don't believe faith in anything makes sense, Some people have faith that not a theological virtue. They say they believe things that aren't what we would mean as faith, if that makes sense. So yeah, it has to be tied to hope and love. And we know that because scripture ties them together too. Faith, hope, and love are these three that have to be connected together. So in many ways, it's like one of those things, it's like it's revealed to us, has to be together. So that hope, and kind of going along with it, and not just thinking all will be well. There was a quote I always loved by Saint Bakita, and she said, "I am definitely loved, and whatever happens to me, I am awaited by this love, and so my life is good." So she associates this goodness of life by the love that awaits her, the hope of the love that awaits her, not what happens in this life. So love, you get to love. Love elevates the will to love God, and love God even just purely for the sake of loving God. And we believe, and I think this was in the Catechism too, love reorders all of the priorities of life. And many of us probably can understand there's this like power of, we're going to love not just as a feeling, of course, but as an act of the will. But there's this power of love to reorder things and to put them into perspective. So love is a movement of the will. It's not, of course, it's not just like a shallow thing of being nice or trying to be polite or kind in a certain situation, but it's, and we've talked about this before, willing the good of the other. The interesting thing about love, and I'm forgetting, I didn't write down which reading talked about this, but it says, even if an action shows no signs of any special distinguishing characteristics, if it is with love, then it is not just common. And I think that's a really important thing, that anything you can do can be elevated to love, to do with love. I remember I stayed at a place once that was like a Catholic community, intentional living, and it had a sign by the sink. It said, wash the dishes not just because they're dirty, but because you love the person who will use them next. So it's like anyone who, who does something with love, it's not just an ordinary act anymore. It goes beyond that. So, St. Augustine, and I forget if they added this in the Catechism, he said, have love and do what you will. So there's this interesting line that, of course, the love is going to inform, that's what he means, not just like do whatever you want, but have love and do what you will. The foundation of all of this, all of the virtue is love. One important thing with love too, that the readings touched on, is that some of the things that we talk about in virtue, about kind of not being attached to worldly things, or having, hating worldly things, or not going along with them, it always has to be rooted in love, and not just the, Father Seamus mentions this sometimes, not just the rejection of something. And I think this is really prevalent now too. You can kind of think of a lot of examples. So I could not like something, or not liking sounds kind of silly, but I could not agree with something, or not want to endorse something, and someone else could feel similarly. But our reasons for doing so could be vastly different, to the point where we really wouldn't be thinking the same way at all. Because one person can be coming at it from a place of rejection, of just hating things, not wanting to promote it. And the other is moving towards love. That the reason why I want to endorse this is because of love of God and because of everything else in the positive of, in the sense of everything else that makes that thing not the good for the person. And so the contempt, how I think they said it in the reading, the contempt that arises out of growth in love is different from a contempt of the world based on man's own judgment or opinions, not from a supernatural love of God. And this happens sometimes. People try to find like common ground with the Christian faith from enemies, common enemies, to bolster their platform for another reason, maybe. So there's a number of things maybe we can think of that are like that. They might be like, oh, well, like the Christians don't endorse this too. Let's, team up with them. But it's like, okay, maybe not the same thing. They're kind of prioritizing the love of God can never have an arrogance or a hostility to the nature of our being here on earth, to that we're humans. It can't carry a form of pride that, okay, I love God above all else. All this other stuff means nothing, It's not a separation from the world in that sense, but like a calling to a higher love of God. Saint Teresa of Avila, in the reading we read from her, she says, she kind of describes love as like this litmus test. Like, you're on the right track if you're growing in love of the people around you and of God, because love is at the core of it. And we know our famous excerpt from 1 Corinthians 13 about love. If I speak in human and angelic tongues, but do not have love, I am a resounding gong or a clashing cymbal. And if I have the gift of prophecy and comprehend all mysteries and all knowledge, if I have all faith so as to move mountains, but do not have love, I have nothing. And then it goes on to say, so faith, hope, love remain, these three, but the greatest of these is love. And I've heard it explained before that it's like faith and hope, when you get to heaven, they kind of fade away. They melt into the rest because you already are with face to face with Christ, who you have had faith and hope in. What you had hoped for is there. What you have had faith in, and now it's love. So that's faith, hope, and love.
Question.
Yeah.
The readings talk about faith, hope, and charity, especially the catechism.
Yeah.
And yet we're talking faith, hope, and love. That makes sense to me, but the readings didn't really concentrate there. They concentrated on charity.
They use that, well, at least like the Piper, they use them interchangeably a little bit. In the Catechism, it does. I'm trying to remember. It calls charity and love, but yeah, I'm kind of using it interchangeably. That charity and love are.
The problem is contemporary English. We think of charity as being doing nice things for people.
It got kind of tainted.
That's not really the definition from a Catholic perspective. So they don't mean anything less than love. So when they say faith, hope, and charity, they mean faith, hope, and love.
Well, that was in the readings. It did explain, I think, that the real meaning of charity goes back to what it used to mean, not what it currently means. So I thought that was good. But
Yeah.
It just doesn't seem right to me that it's not in the catechism that way. It's faith, hope, and love.
I think part of it is just linguistic, to be honest. It's not that they're diminishing the strength of it. It's really more just they're using a more archaic or traditional. Part of it is it goes back. So the Catechism was written in Latin, and so it's actually more the translator. So I'm sure that it was fides, spes, and caritas.
Caritas is
Right? So those are the three in Latin. Well, you can translate caritas love or charity, and the translator decided to translate it charity, but it's the same word in Latin. So that's part of this too. Sometimes it's just a matter of how they translated it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's interesting too, because at least most translations of scripture would be St. Paul talking about faith, hope, and love, not faith, hope, and charity. So it's interesting because the Catechism would quote that too. So it's interesting.
English language, when it comes to love, is abysmal. It makes me worry that we're not very good at loving in the English-speaking world, because our language is just horrific. Like, there's no distinctions. You love pizza and you love your mother. I mean, that's absurd that we use the same word for those two dispositions. And yet we have really, it's very odd. And then even like this whole thing with charity. And so English, we lack precision with regard to the language around love.
How was it in Greek? As I recall, Greek's got like 10 different words for love.
Yeah, at least the one, so C.S. Lewis, if you want to read a good book, C.S. Lewis has a book called The Four Loves. Or if you also, Pope Benedict has an encyclical, Deus Caritas Est, God is love.
It's like agape.
And he goes through the same Greek categories, which I think it's really important for English speakers to develop a lexicon that can explore the different dimensions of love, because our language, we have to use other language because English doesn't really do it. So we have to resort to the Greek in order to get the nuances that it really needs.
I may be incorrect in this, but even, like when Christ asks Peter, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? After his denial, there is in the Greek translation, isn't it, don't they use the different versions of love, like agape or?
It's the Greek original, in the Koine. The first two, and I forget the interplay, but it's the interplay between storge and agape, I believe. And there's a movement that in English is completely lost on the reader, but in Greek it becomes clear.
Cool. Okay.
So we'll move a little bit. I'll go over, but I think we'll still get small group time as well. But I'm just going to go a little bit over to vice. But before we get to exactly what vice is, and we touched upon this a little bit of like a rise and fall of virtue, how they all rise and fall together. When we go through these cardinal and theological virtues, God as the basis for all of them. But how do they play out when someone kind of fails at something? Are people going to do things perfectly all the time, even if they have a lot of virtue built? And I wanted to, there's a little example, which I always thought was kind of profound. I don't know if any of you have read the book He Leadeth Me. It's by, he's now a servant of God. His causes open up for canonization for a while. Father Walter Ciszek. He was a Polish-American priest, and he did this clandestine missionary work in the Soviet Union, or what was then the Soviet Union. He went there like 1940, and he was there for a number of years. He spent 15 years there in solitary confinement, and then 5 years in a labor camp. And he wrote this book, He Leadeth Me. And it's an interesting book, but I think one of the parts that really stuck with me the most was when he talks about falling from virtue. And so I wanted to use that example. So he was, when he was captured and went to the labor camp, and when he was imprisoned, they put him on charges as being a spy for the Vatican. And so they would do these interrogations, and the interrogations lasted like years. They were really, really intense. And he kind of went in, and he was he had wanted to go to the Soviet Union. He was like, people need a priest there. I'm going to go minister to people secretly. And so he had been building a lot of virtue, a lot of courage. And he went there, and he would go at interrogation after interrogation. And he was like, I walked in there and I felt like they have to believe me because this seems like such a ridiculous thing they're accusing me of. And he said at a certain point, he didn't know if they actually believed what his the actual charge, or if they were just stubborn to say that they had made a mistake and let him go. So he talks about the interrogations and being in solitary confinement. He says the sessions would last for days at a time, and most of the time throughout a night. And they wanted from him a false confession, and they gave him a lot of promises. So you kind of go through the book, and I don't think this will ruin the book for you, but you kind of go, it might a little bit. You go through the book, and you're like, oh, he's going to persevere and, not go through with the false confession. And this is what he writes. He says, as I signed the pages, these are the pages of the false confession. Largely without reading them, I began to burn with shame and guilt. I was totally broken, totally humiliated. It was a moment of agony I'll never forget as long as I live. I was full of fear and yet tormented by conscience. After signing the first 100 pages, I stopped even the pretense of reading the rest. I just wanted to finish signing them as quickly as possible and get out of the interrogator's office. My aversion to the whole thing was overwhelming. I condemned myself before anyone else could do the same. I was despicable to my own eyes, no less than I must appear to others. My will had failed. I had proven to be nowhere near the man I thought I was. I had yielded in that one sickening split second to fear, threats, and the thought of death. When the last page was finished, I wanted to run from the interrogator's office. Back in my cell, I stood shaken and defeated. At first, I could not even grasp the dimensions of what had happened to me in the interrogator's office and why. He goes on and on again. He says, I reproached myself for caving in out of fear, for giving way to panic, and for acting sheerly out of defense. And I did not spare God these reproaches. Why had he failed me at this critical juncture? Why had he not sustained my strength and my nerve? Why had he not inspired me to speak out boldly? Why had he not shielded me by his grace from the fear of death? And why had he not, at last resort, seen to it that I suffered a heart attack from all this tension or a stroke, so that I would not have been able to sign them? I had trusted him and in his spirit to give me a voice and wisdom against all adversaries. Slowly, reluctantly, I faced the truth that it was at the root of my problem and my shame. The answer was a single word, I. I was ashamed because I knew in my heart that I had tried to do too much on my own and I had failed. I felt guilty because I realized finally that I had asked for God's help, but I'd really believed in my own ability to avoid evil and meet every challenge. I had spent time in prayer, but had depended on my good physique, steady nerves, and a strong will. And that these physical graces given by God, I would continue to do his will at all times and to the best of my ability. In short, I felt guilty and ashamed because in the last analysis, I had relied almost completely on myself in this most critical test, and I had failed. So it goes on and on. It's interesting. So this isn't vice, but it's a reiteration that he got to a weak point, and all the virtue or natural abilities that he had failed him. And he explains it later that it was he had this humiliating experience that enabled him to depend completely on God. Later he says, God must sometimes allow us to act on our own so that we can learn humility, so that we can learn the truth of our total dependence on him, so that we can learn that all our actions are sustained by his grace, and that without him, we can do nothing. So I wanted to just include that in the transition to when we talk about the fall of virtue and vice, because in a lot of talking about virtue, people might be like, oh yeah, I want to have perfect virtue across the board. And hopefully I've reiterated this enough. You can't do it without God. You're going to need we need to rely on him. And I think it's important, even in how we teach others about virtue, or explain virtue as well. In the beginning, I had mentioned about people being worried about virtue being overly philosophical or overly psychological. And sometimes we partner virtue with things that are not like even just like behavioral things, like, okay, you're virtuous if you sit still and be quiet and, follow everything that an adult is telling you or someone else. And that's not what it means to be virtuous. That it's not to be controlled by someone else. Over and over again in our readings, it kind of talks about the freedom of virtue, because it's the person living as their self, fully how God wanted them to be. So that's kind of just to emphasize this importance of relying on God in virtue, and not our own ability and our own striving. So vice. Vice, similar to virtue, is a habit. So I know in previous I think in like the confession session and also about the fall, we've talked about sin a bit. Vice is the habitual inclination to sin. The Catechism has an interesting description of the proliferation of sin. And it says it spreads like fruit flies, and it can be reproduced very quickly. So vices are often classified by the virtues that they go against. We know that capital sins are pride, avarice, envy, wrath, lust, gluttony, and sloth. We just, as a review, we know that the virtues, they moderate our passions. And Father Seamus mentioned this last week too. Passions are neither good nor bad. But some of these passions can lead to sin. Some of them can be moderated. Sometimes we moderate them by virtue. And there's many examples of this. For example, someone could have the instinct to be loyal to their family. And that instinct could lead them both to either, if they have control over that. Oh no, everyone's coughing. To have control over that, and have the virtue help rein that passion. Or it can lead someone to sin by doing something that is unjust for loyalty of the family. So vice is a habit inclining one to sin. It's the product of repeated sinful acts of a given kind. And when formed, it is also, like in the reverse way too, the vice, the attraction to it also repeats it. It's like a cycle. So routine sins develop vice within us. I'm going to skip a little bit ahead. One thing, and Aquinas explains this a little bit, is that often the person stuck in vice doesn't see it as a vice. they continue to sin and continue to justify it. A vice can be overcome, which is hopeful, which we know from the Catechism and some of our reading. How is a vice overcome? So one of our main ways, of course, that our faith teaches is you go to confession. You go to confession, you receive the reality of God's mercy and the grace of the sacrament. Now, that inclination or that kind of attraction to that sin might not go away, oftentimes does not after the confession, but that inclination of it, to it, isn't the vice necessarily. It might be, you might be addicted to something, but it wouldn't necessarily be the vice. Grace helps us to see that sin must stop, to cut off sin. So how do you grow in virtue? The sacraments, prayer, penance, and also, we mentioned this rise and fall in virtue. How do you decrease in virtue? So if a just person, someone can say, I'm a really just person, maybe they have been a really just person. If they, for some reason, start making repeated acts against justice, doing something very unjust, that person would be decreasing, would be kind of compromising their virtue of justice along with the other virtues. So these virtues in the person would diminish, and he would suffer from this disorder now of the vice of injustice. So that would be the practice of injustice. And this is a disorder, and we mean by disorder is that it's not ordered correctly to the end. There's different vices even we see in society. Like I said before, we're not isolated individuals. We're linked together through all different bonds, familial and other societal bonds. So they all interact, and a lot of times, just like the Catechism had said about vice kind of spreading like fruit flies, that can be from person to person as well. The spread of vice influenced by those around us. One of this, I know I was talking about Aquinas in his description of justice, and he says a sin against justice would be maybe a sin against justice in speech. I mentioned maligning before, so derision could be something like this. He has like all of these interesting terms. I had to look them up, like reviling, which is dishonoring someone publicly, backbiting, unjustly dishonoring someone secretly. So publicly, secretly, talebearing, which is seeking to destroy a friendship, and derision, which is shaming another unjustly. So all of these things, you can kind of see that those vices practiced in someone can kind of spread like wildfire. And in our society, I think those are even particular ones of, you look at the news or different political situations, and it's like, that's the normal. The practice of those vices are normalized in many ways. Saint Teresa of Avila talks about sham virtues, virtues that are a sham. And she says, there's a difference between powers of the soul and powers of imagination. And she said, the devil's wiles are many. He would turn hell upside down 1,000 times to make us think ourselves better than we are. I thought that was a cool sentence that she said. So she said, sometimes we think we will act away. And she gives the example of saying, someone saying, I will take any insult that someone throws at me as a Christian, as someone from my faith. So like if someone tells me something like that goes against me, I won't say anything back to them. And she says, but then the same person, someone mentions one of their defects and then they get super, super defensive. So she says that's a sham virtue. You might, in your mind, think, I'm not going to do that, or I'm not going to respond that way. But in reality, they responded that way. So I'm going to kind of, try to wrap up a little bit and then give us some time for groups or maybe just a discussion altogether. But to kind of tie things together. So we know our faith, of course, is central to this. Christ is our model for all of these ways that we live a good life. In the Lorda reading, the one on virtue of holiness, he describes the need for doing repeated things, habits. And he said the early Christians knew this well, and that's why they had these prayers that they would say over and over again. That's why we have these memorized prayers to remind us about the truths of our faith over and over again. And so he was saying this is how we have virtue and our faith penetrate daily life in some ways. I don't know if any of you, he mentions the egg boiling thing, boiling an egg for 2 Our Fathers. I was like, that's a really raw egg then, but maybe they're praying really slowly. But he talks about these fundamental convictions and being reminded of them. So just how I mentioned how vice can spread very easily, even among people. He mentions that repeated action, deliberate action is really important. And, I'm thinking of this, there's different ways that that people order their lives and their routines to this. So in a monastery, there's an intentional rhythm of how to foster virtue among people. In the Rule of Saint Benedict, he mentions, having an integrity of life and building up a storehouse of virtue for good living. So this rhythm and pattern of life. Alternatively, then, culture and pattern of life can be make building virtue much less common than there. One way we have it today, a common term to many of us would even be virtue signaling, which is a kind of an interesting concept where virtue signaling is actually not even in the realm of virtue because it's not action. It's not it's a signaling of being a good person with just stating an opinion or just kind of trying to portray oneself in a way as being morally great or morally superior to another. So it's this insincerity of what actual practice of virtue is. Okay, I'm getting to the end soon. I think I need to, but so just to kind of close with that, we know that there's no way really then to short circuit the practice of virtue in many ways. A lot of it is deliberate persistence and consistency in it. And we can kind of see from different forms of interactions or patterns of life or our society how we can foster virtue. And that's one of the questions I have for our small groups about how do we foster virtue, not just within ourselves, but in our families, in our society. I think that's all I'll go over today.